ASP.NET MVC includes two project templates for use with Visual Studio 2008 and 2010. The first is ASP.NET MVC2 Empty Web Application and ASP.NET MVC2 Web Application. Both templates are available for both Visual Basic and C#. Other than the language, the templates are identical. You can access the templates from the New Project dialog box that opens when you select File, New Project from the Visual Studio menu. The Web Application template creates a basic but fully functional MVC application, complete with a model, a couple of controllers, and a few views. It uses best practice HTML with CSS or cascading style sheets to format the views. It also includes support for authentication and authorization, using the built-in features of ASP.NET. In fact, this is one of many ways that you can see how MVC is built on top of ASP.NET. Rather than being an alternative to it, you still have access to many of the built-in services that are part of ASP.NET. This template gives you the option of creating a tests project in addition to the main application project so that you can write unit tests. The Empty Web Application template sets up the project structure, including folders for models, views, and controllers, and sets the references you need to the MVC framework. It provides a really good starting point for a new application that you'll develop from scratch, including building your own CSS styles for views. If you want to create a unit test project with a project created from this template, you'll need to add that manually after you create the empty web application. It really doesn't matter which of these two templates you use. Both provide support for MVC applications, and both are much simpler than starting with a completely blank solution. For the most part, when you're first learning MVC, I really recommend that you generally start with the web application template. Even if you have to delete a view or two or remove other elements, you'll get more guidance about how to structure your own applications. You can use the existing views and controllers to experiment with MVC features without taking the time to get an entire application set up. Then, once you know MVC, you can use the empty web application template to start with a clean slate for new applications. What we're going to do now is create a default MVC web application and use it to explore some of its runtime interface features. And then a little later, we'll start looking at the structure of the application and the code that implements it. I have Visual Studio 2010 running, and I'll select File, New Project. And I'll be here within the Web section of the templates. Notice that we have an ASP.NET MVC2 web application and an ASP.NET MVC2 empty web application. So this is the one that you can use to start an application that doesn't have any controllers, views, and so forth already installed as part of it. But in this case, I'm going to create the web application. I'll put it in a convenient location and name it Sample MVC. And click on OK. And that brings up the Create Unit Test Project dialog box. This is the dialog box that I can use in order to create a unit test as part of the solution when Visual Studio is creating all of these project elements. So I can opt yes, and it'll give me a test project name, a default name that I can change. And then I can also select the test framework. In this case, all I have is the Visual Studio Unit Test. This is installed as part of Visual Studio Professional and higher editions. The nice thing here is that if you want to use a third-party or open source unit test framework, you can do that. If it's installed on the machine and it's compatible with Visual Studio, it'll appear within that list. And of course, alternatively, you can opt not to create a unit test project. But for this sample application, I'll go ahead and accept the defaults and create that project. After a couple moments, Visual Studio creates the two projects. The main Sample MVC application, and then the Sample MVC.tests project. I'll go ahead and select the web application and run the application. As you can see, the ASP.NET Development Server started down here. And if I open that back up, you can see that it's on port 49318. and that corresponds to the URL there. Notice that this is a fully functional application. It doesn't do all that much, but it's fully functional. It uses a tabbed interface to go between home and about pages. And it also supports authentication and registration using the ASP.NET membership management features. So I'll go ahead and click there. Now, because this is the first time I'm running this brand new application, there's nothing to log into. There's no existing credentials. So I can go in and register. And I'll create a username of appdev, don@appdev.com, not a real email address. And I'll use a secure appdev password. And click on register. And as you can see, I'm now logged in as appdev. This link is changed to log off. And these are all features that are part of the membership management application within ASP.NET. In fact, this is one demonstration that because MVC is part of ASP.NET, you can hook into many of the same features, the same sets of infrastructure that you can from a web forms application. All right, I'll go ahead and close the browser. So that's great. That's a lot of application for, up to now, very little work. So as you can see, it provides a good chunk of the infrastructure that you need for probably most real-world applications. And you can remove features as you need to, and then build upon the infrastructure in order to create your own applications. Now that we've seen what the application does, let's start exploring the structure of the application. First thing I'll do is clean up the UI a little bit, make it a little bit easier to see, and go back over here to Solution Explorer. Now, as you explore the structure of an MVC application, and if you're coming from an ASP.NET Web Forms application background, it's all going to seem pretty strange at first. But if you generally understand the MVC pattern, you'll soon understand how an MVC application works. It really is a rather elegant architecture. So here in Solution Explorer, you can see the structure of the application. There again are the two projects, Sample MVC and the tests. And I'm just going to close that. We'll talk about tests a little bit later. There are a few standard ASP.NET type directories here, or objects. First is properties, and that's where you can find the assembly info file. There's a list of references. And as you can see, the system.web.mvc and system.web.routing are shown there. And then there's also app data. This is where you'll put any local databases. And in fact, if I select Show All Files here, you can see that we have an ASP.NETDB.mdf file, which is a SQL Express file that contains all of the membership and registration information to support the application. And just like a regular ASP.NET application, you can remove this file and redirect the application to use maybe a database on a full instance of SQL Server or some other data store in order to save that information. You have all that same kind of flexibility. Or in fact, if you're not going to use authentication and authorization in your application, you can just go ahead and remove that database entirely. And then you can also remove the account controller and some other features. Now, the other standard folders in the project have specific uses within an MVC application. You're going to virtually always want to use those folders, these specific folders, following the conventions of MVC in order to take advantage of the benefits of convention over configuration. By sticking to the conventions, you won't have to do any messy configurations, and you can write much simpler code. So the first folder here is Content. And as you can see, it contains the Cascading Style Sheets file that supports this application. This is where you should place support files for the application, particularly files that either format or create content, including images. This application doesn't have any images, so there's no images subfolder. The next folder is the Controllers folder. As you can probably guess from the name, this is where you should put your controllers. And as you can see, the sample application comes with an account controller that handles all of the membership management features, and then the home controller, which is the overall traffic cop for the application. Now there's another important convention here. Besides the fact that you put these files within the controllers folder, the controllers all must have a name that is something controller. And the combination of those is how MVC can identify and use these files in order to implement controllers when you navigate to a particular URL. Again, it's the convention over configuration. If you do these things, put them in the right place, name them the right thing, as well as a couple other things, then they qualify as controllers. The next folder is the Models folder. And as you can see, we have a single file here, Account Models. And this defines the model that is used by the membership management features within the application. As you can see, there's not a model that apparently is associated with the home controller, although naming here doesn't matter at all. There's no conventions as far as what you call these files. So you should put all of your model files here, and it might include things like entity framework files, link to SQL, any custom objects as account models, that's a custom object, or any other classes that define the models for your application, in addition to any support classes that support those model files. A typical application could have just a single class here, or it might have dozens. It really depends on the data stores that the application uses, whether it's one or more or whatever, how it makes use of the data, and the business rules it implements. But keep in mind that this is the model, these are the classes that define the model. Any local data stores should be placed within the App Data folder here. These are the classes that define the model. In larger applications, you're probably going to want to create a separate class library project in Visual Studio to hold the model. And then you can add a reference to this main MVC application to that additional project. This more cleanly enforces a separation of concerns in the model, and you can reuse the model in different applications or in components of the same application. But if you're just going to have a single file, not going to share it amongst applications, putting it here in the local models folder is fine. Next we have the scripts folder, and as you can see there's a number of files there. As you can probably guess from the name, this is where you should place all of the JavaScript files used by your application to support client-side features. Now Visual Studio populates the folder with various jQuery, AJAX, and MVC support scripts. You really probably shouldn't remove any of these files until you're sure that your application isn't going to use any of them. Microsoft is tending towards a pretty fine granularity in its JavaScript implementation, and so that's why you have so many different files. They're also moving towards support for jQuery as their primary client-side JavaScript technology. So that's why you see jQuery built in as part of this application. And then you have the Microsoft AJAX. This is the AJAX client library, the debug version and the release version. And then some files that support client-side MVC, including validation and other features. But you should put all of your custom JavaScript files here as well. You can still embed them within the page, but if you put them in separate files, put them in this folder. By the way, jQuery is probably something you're going to want to learn something about. It's a third-party open-source JavaScript framework that Microsoft has begun distributing with Visual Studio, starting with Visual Studio 2010. And surprisingly enough, it's also fully supporting jQuery. If you write client-side JavaScript, it can really simplify the code that you have to write, making it much easier to write rich, responsive web applications. And you can learn more about it at jQuery.com. And Microsoft is starting to document it as well. All right, next up we have the Views folder. Again, you can probably guess this is where the views should go, and it has a little bit more complex structure. The way this works is that you have a separate subfolder of views for each of the controllers within the application. Again, if I open up this again, you can see we have two controllers, so we have two different folders here, named the same name as the controller, but not including the controller suffix. So this includes all the views for the account and the home controller. So as you can see, we have the About tab and the Index tab on the page, or this is actually the Home tab on the page. And so you have one file per view. So for any views that are associated with the controller, you should put them within this subfolder of the Views folder. If there are any views in the application that are shared amongst two or more controllers, then you should put them in the Shared folder. And here you can see we have an error view. Errors can happen in any controller, so it's a shared view. And then we also have a logon user control. And this is shared amongst all of the pages because it's part of the master page. And as you can see, the site uses a master page in order to provide consistent interface to the application. So this once again uses convention over configuration. If you put the views in the right places, then you don't need to write code and provide a path to the individual view files. An important thing to understand here is that even though the views are implemented as .aspx files, these are not web forms. They don't inherit directly from system.web.page, nor do they normally have code behind files. You can add a code behind file to a view, but it's a little bit convoluted, it's manual, and you're really fighting MVC in order to do it. So generally it's not something that you want to do. There's virtually always a better way in an MVC application than writing code within a code behind. So resist the temptation, even if you're used to it from a web forms perspective. All right, so that's the overall structure of the application. I'm going to go ahead and run the application again. As I navigate around the application, I want you to pay attention to the URLs here. So I'm running this on the local machine, so I'm using localhost. And as I showed you, we're running on the ASP.NET Web Development Server, so I'm using port 49318 for that. So this is the index view, which is identified in the user interface as the home page, if you will, of this application. When I click over to the About page, notice that the URL is now /home/about. So this is the name of the controller, and this is the name of the action method that I want to execute. Keep in mind again that MVC applications are all about calling methods, not about loading physical resources. There is no page located at home/about.aspx. There is an about.aspx, but it's not in a home directory that's off of the root of the application. Now let me click on the logon, and as you can see, I'm now in the account controller, and it's calling the logon method. If I click on the register link here, and now we're still within the account controller, but have called the register method, and this displays this view. Now hopefully you can start to see a pattern in these web addresses. Other than that default address for when I first started the application, the URLs follow a specific pattern. I'll come over here to Notepad, and it consists of the domain. As usual, it has to be usually www.something.com or whatever, and then the controller, and then the action method, I'll just call it method here, followed optionally by an ID. So that's the pattern of the route that we're using within this application. This is where some of the magic of MVC comes into play. None of the application URLs contain links to any ASPX pages, but it's through the definition of this route that allows MVC to identify what views you want to present to the user. And you can pass in some optional information. So let me minimize that and stop the application and go in here to the global.asax file. Double click on it, try to open it. There we go. So this is the key to how routes are defined within the application. It defines the routing that maps the URL ultimately to the action method, and then also passes in some additional information to the application so that it can present a view to the user. Now there are two important snippets here. The first one is this call to the register routes method here within the application start event procedure. This is the event that runs the first time a user makes a request for a page within this application. And this is the same as any ASP.NET application. You can do that in any kind of application. And the register routes method defines the structure of the routes used by the application. So here's that method, and it's calling the map route method of the routes collection, this routes collection that is passed into that method directly. Now this map route method has several overloads, But the one that is used here by default takes 3 different parameters. The first one is the name of the route. This lets you specify which route to use. Now, most of the time, you won't need to explicitly use this name, but it is helpful when you want to format URLs or reference particular routes. So it has a use within MVC. The second parameter is the URL pattern for the route. This is what defines that controller action ID structure of the URLs. The names in the curly brackets are essentially the parameters of the route. And this determines in the default route that the first item is the controller, the second is the action name, and the third is the ID parameter. So a little bit of the magic is being washed away. And then the third parameter is the default route values. These are the defaults for the parameters. So as you can see, if I don't specify a parameter for the controller, I get the home controller. If I don't specify an action method, I get the index action method. And then the ID parameter is optional. So this is why when I first started up the application and it was just localhost : the port number, and I didn't specify a controller or action method, that's why I got the index method of the home controller, because those are the defaults. And that's where those are defined right there. Now, routing is not an ASP.NET MVC feature as such. It's implemented in the system.web.routing namespace in the .NET Framework 4.0. And it's available to any ASP.NET application. You can use it in a web forms application where it's useful for making URLs more search engine friendly, which means that they're more searchable. But in MVC, it provides a way to map URLs to methods in the various application controllers. I also want to point out this comment here. If you're going to run an MVC application on either IIS 6 or IIS 7 in classic mode, you want to make sure that you visit this link. You're going to need to perform some additional setup tasks to accommodate routing. You're going to be needing to do some additional configuration if you're running an IIS 6 or IIS 7 in classic mode. And the link takes you to a language-specific tutorial on the www.asp.net site called Using ASP.NET MVC with Different Versions of IIS. No rocket science involved here, but you do need to do some additional configuration on the server. This can be an issue with hosting companies, but most companies that host ASP.NET applications by now are used to dealing with MVC, and it's probably just flipping a switch someplace in order to enable those features for you.